Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Titanic's third class. Cramped bunks, locked gates, ice-cold water rising, and your ticket cost everything you own. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Though you might want to check that all your doors are unlocked before we start. You'll understand why. Let's start with the ticket, because before you even set foot on the Titanic, before you saw the massive hull, or smelled the ocean air, or felt the deck beneath your feet, you made a choice. Or rather, circumstances made it for you. You were going third class, because that is all you could afford. And that single economic reality determined whether you lived or died. On the 15th of April, 1912. The third-class ticket cost between £7 and £8 depending on where you boarded. That is roughly $900 to $1,000 in today's money. Which doesn't sound like much until you realise that for most third-class passengers, this represented months or even years of savings. Everything they had. Sold their possessions, borrowed from family, scraped together every penny to buy passage to America, and the promise of a better life. You weren't taking a vacation. You were making a one-way bet that the new world would be better than the old one, that the poverty in Ireland or Italy or Sweden or Syria was worse than whatever awaited you in New York with no money, no connections, and often no English. The ticket was supposed to be the hard part, spending everything you owned on a single journey. The dying part wasn't supposed to be included in the price. The White Star Line marketed third class as comfortable and affordable. They weren't lying exactly. They were just leaving out important context. Comfortable compared to what? Affordable for whom? The answer was comfortable compared to the absolute hellholes that most immigrant ships provided, and affordable if you were willing to bet your entire financial existence on not drowning. The first-class passengers paid £870 for a parlour suite. That is $109,000 in today's money. So while you were in third class having spent your life savings on a £7 ticket, someone upstairs paid 124 times more for a room with a private promenade deck and a bed that didn't touch two walls simultaneously. This price difference wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. But you wouldn't know that until it was too late. Now let's talk about boarding, because the experience of getting onto the Titanic differed dramatically, depending on which class you'd paid for. And the differences started immediately, before the ship even left port. If you were first class, you boarded at Southampton or Cherbourg, walking up a carpeted gangway while stewards carried your 17 pieces of luggage and addressed you as sir or madam. Your boarding process involved champagne, welcoming committees, and tours of your luxurious accommodations. You were treated like royalty because, by 1912 standards, you basically were. If you were third class, you boarded like cargo. At Southampton, third-class passengers entered through a different gangway entirely, separated from first and second class to prevent mixing. You weren't offered champagne. You were offered a medical inspection. The medical inspection was mandatory for third class only, not because the White Star Line cared about your health, but because us immigration law required it. Ships that brought immigrants who failed medical inspection at Ellis Island had to pay for their return passage. So the shipping companies screened you before boarding to avoid eating those costs. Your health wasn't about you. It was about their profit margins. The doctor's examination was quick and humiliating. He'd check your eyes for trachoma, a bacterial infection that caused blindness and was grounds for rejection. He'd look at your skin for signs of disease. He'd ask you to walk to check for disabilities. The entire process took maybe 2 minutes per person, long enough to spot obvious problems, but nowhere near thorough enough to catch anything that wasn't immediately visible. If you passed, you got a stamp. If you failed, you didn't board. Simple as that. Families were sometimes split up at this stage. One member rejected while the others boarded, forcing impossible choices about whether to continue or stay behind. The White Star Line didn't care. They had your ticket money either way. After passing inspection, you were directed through a maze of corridors to reach the third-class accommodations, which were located at the bow and stern of the ship. The least desirable locations because of noise and vibration from the engines, and the tendency to pitch more dramatically in rough seas. First class was in the middle, the most stable part of the ship. This wasn't accident. This was designed. The descent to third class took you through multiple decks, down narrow staircases, through passages that grew progressively less decorated, until you reached your quarters, which were located on E, F, and G decks. That is 5 to 6 decks below the boat deck where the lifeboats were stored. Remember that number, 5 to 6 decks down. You'll need to climb all of them in darkness while the ship sinks. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Your cabin, if you could call it that, was based on your family size and gender. Single men were separated from single women by the entire length of the ship, men at the bow, women at the stern. This was to prevent moral impropriety. The Edwardian way of saying they didn't want poor people having sex on their ship. Families got cabins in the middle, but even then, adult men and women were sometimes separated, unless they could prove they were married. The typical third-class cabin measured about 7 feet by 8 feet. That is 56 square feet. For context, a modern parking space is about 180 square feet. Your entire living space on the Titanic was 1/3 of a parking space, and you shared it. The 2-person cabins had bunk beds bolted to the walls. The 4-person cabins had 2 sets of bunks. The larger cabins for families with children had up to 6 or 8 bunks stacked and squeezed into a space that would feel cramped for 2 people. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a theoretical concept. You lived on top of each other, literally, for the entire voyage. The bunks were metal frames with thin mattresses, a pillow, and 2 blankets. The mattress was basically a bag filled with straw or horsehair compressed from previous passengers into a lumpy, uncomfortable surface that provided minimal cushioning against the metal frame beneath. You could feel every weld, every rivet, through the thin material. Sleeping on it was like sleeping on a slightly padded park bench that also happened to be vibrating constantly from the engines. The blankets were wool, scratchy, and smelling like industrial laundry soap mixed with mildew. They'd been used by hundreds of previous passengers and washed in seawater between voyages. Freshness was not their primary quality. Warmth was, and they did provide that, but at the cost of comfort and any olfactory pleasure. Each cabin had a small wash basin, 1 basin per cabin, regardless of how many people occupied it. The water was cold, always cold. Hot water was available in the communal bathrooms, which we'll get to, but in your cabin, you got cold salt water from a tap that worked intermittently depending on the ship's water pressure. Washing your face in the morning meant shocking your system awake with near-freezing seawater that left your skin feeling tight and salty for hours. There was no closet, no wardrobe, no storage beyond the space under your bunk, and some hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. Most third-class passengers travelled with 1 bag, or trunk containing everything they owned in the world. That bag lived under the bunk, or in the narrow space between bunks, taking up floor space and making the already cramped cabin feel even smaller. The lighting was a single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling, operated by a switch near the door. Electric lighting was new technology in 1912, a luxury that the Titanic marketed heavily. Third class got electricity, yes, but the bare minimum. 1 weak bulb that cast harsh shadows and left corners in darkness. Reading was difficult. Privacy was impossible, because turning off the light meant total darkness for everyone in the cabin. The walls were white painted metal, no decoration, no artwork, no portholes in most cabins. You were below the waterline, so natural light didn't exist. Your world was white metal walls, a weak electric bulb, and the constant vibration and noise of the engines that shook everything, rattling the metal bunks, humming through the walls, creating a low-frequency drone that you felt in your bones more than heard. The floor was bare metal, painted white cold against bare feet. No carpets, no rugs, no softness anywhere. Every surface was hard, cold, industrial. The cabin wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to pack maximum humans into minimum space while meeting the bare requirements of decency. The door locked from the inside with a simple latch. From the outside, it could be locked by crew with a key. This detail becomes important later. You could lock yourself in, but you couldn't lock others out if they had the master key. And several crew members had master keys. Security worked one direction, keeping you in, not keeping them out. The ventilation came from a small air vent near the ceiling, connected to the ship's ventilation system. The air was recycled, smelling of engine oil, cooking grease, body odour, and salt. Fresh air required going up on deck, but deck access for third class was limited to specific times and specific areas. You couldn't just wander. You had assigned spaces, assigned times, assigned everything. The noise was constant and layered. The engine vibration was the bass note, ever present, shaking through the metal structure. On top of that, you heard the ocean against the hull, a rushing hissing sound that varied with the ship's speed. Above that, you heard other passengers, conversations through thin walls, children crying, people coughing, snoring, arguing in a dozen different languages. Privacy of sound didn't exist any more than visual privacy. The temperature varied wildly. Near the engines, the corridors could be stifling, hot and stuffy from the boiler rooms below. Away from the engines, especially at night, the cold seeped in from the Atlantic, making the metal walls and floors freezing to the touch. Your cabin could be comfortable, sweltering, or frigid depending on location and time of day. Climate control wasn't a concept that applied to third class. Now let's talk about the bathrooms, or as they were officially called, the lavatories. Third class had 2 bathroom facilities, one for men at the bow, one for women at the stern. 2 bathrooms for over 700 people. Do the math, it doesn't work. The men's lavatory had 2 bathtubs and several sinks, 2 bathtubs for over 400 men. If every man wanted 1 bath during the week, long voyage, and each bath took 30 minutes, including waiting for the tub to fill and drain, you'd need the bathtubs to be in constant use for 100 hours. There were 168 hours in a week. It was theoretically possible if the bathtubs never sat empty, and men bathed at 3 a.m. In reality, most men didn't bathe at all during the voyage. They washed faces and hands in the sinks, or in their cabin basins. Full bathing was a luxury that the math didn't support. The women's lavatory had similar numbers. 2 tubs for over 200 women. Slightly better ratio, still inadequate. Women were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness than men, but given equal resources to accomplish it. The result was queues, complaints, and a general acceptance that you'd spend the voyage progressively dirtier until you reached New York and could find a proper bathhouse. The toilets were communal, multiple stalls with no doors in some sections, minimal doors in others. Privacy was a luxury for first class. Third class got efficiency. The toilets were connected to a saltwater flush system that worked intermittently. Sometimes the water pressure was good and waste disappeared efficiently. Other times, the system backed up, creating situations we won't describe in detail, but which you can imagine were unpleasant in a closed space, shared by hundreds. The smell in the lavatories was predictably terrible. Industrial soap, sewage, body odor, and salt water combined into an olfactory assault that hit you the moment you entered. You breathed through your mouth, did your business quickly, and left. Lingering was not appealing. Washing clothes was virtually impossible. Some passengers washed small items in their cabin basins, hanging them to dry in the cramped space, creating a humid, musty environment. Larger items stayed dirty for the voyage. You wore the same clothes for days, rotating between 2 outfits if you were lucky enough to own 2. The accumulation of sweat, salt, and grime was inevitable. Everyone smelled by day 3. By day 5, everyone stank. You got used to it because you had no choice. The dining arrangements were marginally better than the sleeping arrangements, but only marginally. Third class had 1 dining saloon, located on F deck, decorated in white paneling with long tables and benches bolted to the floor. It seated about 470 people. There were over 700 third-class passengers. This meant meals happened in 2 sittings, assigned by cabin location. The first sitting ate at assigned times, breakfast at 8 a.m., lunch at noon, dinner at 6 p.m. The second sitting ate an hour later. If you were in the second sitting, you got slightly less choice, because the first sitting had already picked through the options. Food rationing wasn't official policy, but when 470 people go through the line before you, the best portions are gone. The menu was actually decent by third-class standards of the era. The White Star Line fed its third-class passengers better than many immigrant ships, using this as a marketing point. Breakfast included oatmeal, smoked herring, jacket potatoes, and bread with butter and marmalade. Lunch was soup, roast beef or pork, vegetables, and bread. Dinner was similar, with stews, potatoes, bread, and occasionally fruit. This sounds adequate until you consider portion sizes. The servings were sufficient to prevent starvation, but not generous. A working man doing physical labor needs about 3,000 calories. For Dalton Y, the portions provided maybe 2,000 to 2,500. Enough to survive, not enough to thrive. You finished meals, still slightly hungry, always wanting a bit more, but knowing more wasn't available. The food quality varied. The meat was often tough, the cheaper cuts cooked until chewy. The vegetables were boiled into submission, flavorless and mushy. The bread was the highlight, fresh baked daily by the ship's bakery, served warm with real butter. The oatmeal was filling but bland. The soup was usually good, hearty and hot, one of the more reliable items. The dining experience was communal and loud. Hundreds of people eating simultaneously in a large room with metal walls created an echo chamber of clanging dishes, shouted conversations in multiple languages, children crying, and the ever-present engine vibration shaking the floor and tables. Quiet meals didn't exist. You ate quickly, efficiently, amid chaos. The tables seated about 10 people. Purse ID, 20 per table. You didn't choose your table or your seatmates. You sat where there was space, surrounded by strangers who might or might not speak your language. Swedes sat next to Irish, next to Syrians, next to Chinese passengers, all attempting to communicate through gestures and smiles while navigating unfamiliar English food with unfamiliar table manners. The crew serving the meals were stewards professional, but rushed. They had hundreds of people to feed in limited time. Service was efficient, not friendly. They delivered food, refilled water, cleared plates, and moved on. Personal attention wasn't part of the experience. You were processed through the meal like cargo through a loading dock. The plates and utensils were basic. White ceramic plates, metal forks and spoons, no knives because giving knives to hundreds of poor immigrants apparently seemed risky to the White Star Line. If your meat needed cutting, you tore it with your fork or your hands. Elegance was not the goal. Feeding people cheaply and quickly was. Water was unlimited, but served in shared pitchers at each table. You poured your own water into a glass you shared with previous sittings. The glasses were washed between sittings, theoretically, but the volume of dishes and limited staff meant washing was more of a rinse than a thorough cleaning. You drank from glasses that hundreds before you had used, trusting that the rinse was sufficient to prevent disease. Usually it was. Sometimes it wasn't. Tea and coffee were available, served lukewarm and weak. The tea was the cheapest black tea, served without milk or sugar unless you specifically requested it. And even then, supplies were limited. The coffee was worse. A thin, bitter brew made from the cheapest beans, served in the same glasses as the water, because third class didn't rate separate cups. You drank it because it was hot and caffeinated, not because it was good. Beer and spirits were available for purchase at the third class bar, a small room adjacent to the dining saloon. The prices were reasonable by 1912 standards, a beer costing about 4 pence. But when your entire wealth consisted of a few pounds, even small purchases mattered. Some men spent their evenings at the bar, drinking away their anxiety about the future. Others couldn't afford to and watched from the doorway, nursing the free water and wishing they could join. The bar was men only. Women weren't forbidden exactly, but social convention and crew discouragement meant respectable women didn't enter. This left the women with nowhere to socialize in the evenings except the communal areas or their cramped cabins. The men had the bar, the smoking room, and the deck. The women had less. Even in third class, gender inequality thrived. After meals, you had a few hours of free time before the next scheduled activity, which was usually nothing. There were no organised entertainments for third class. No orchestra, no lounge with comfortable seating, no library, no shuffleboard. You entertained yourself, or endured boredom. The general room, a communal space with hard benches bolted to the walls, served as the social centre for third class. It was located on C deck, decorated with white-painted wood panelling and a piano. The piano was the entertainment. Passengers who could play would take turns performing songs from their home countries, leading sing-alongs, providing the only organised entertainment available. If no one could play, the piano sat silent and the room was just a space with benches where people gathered to avoid the claustrophobia of their cabins. The deck access for third class was limited to the poop deck at the stern and a small area at the bow. Both were open-air spaces with no covering, exposed to weather. On sunny days these were pleasant. You could feel wind, see the ocean, watch the wake behind the ship. On cold or rainy days they were miserable. But you went anyway because the alternative was staying below in the cramped, smelly, noisy interior. The poop deck became the social gathering place for third class. People would congregate there in the afternoons, families letting children run around the limited space, young people flirting, older people watching the ocean, and contemplating the massive life change they were undertaking. The deck was maybe 50 feet by 30 feet, 1,500 square feet for over 700 people. When crowded, you stood shoulder to shoulder. Personal space remained a theoretical luxury. The children in third class faced particular challenges. There were no specific areas or activities, no childcare, no nursery, no toys provided. Children played in the corridors, in cabins, on the deck when allowed, creating their own entertainment from nothing. The younger ones cried often, overwhelmed by the strange environment, the constant noise, the separation from familiar surroundings. The older ones adapted faster, treating the ship like an adventure, making friends across language barriers through games and shared exploration. The dangers to children were numerous and unaddressed. The staircases were steep and metal. The corridors were crowded. The machinery was exposed in some areas. Children could and did get injured, falling on stairs, getting fingers caught in doors, burning themselves on hot pipes. Medical care was available from the ship's doctor, but he was primarily focused on first class. Third-class injuries rated minimal attention unless life-threatening. The noise level affected children more than adults. The constant engine vibration, the clanging metal, the echoing conversations, the crying of other children, all combined into a sensory overload that left many children irritable and exhausted. Sleep was difficult even for adults. For children, it was harder. Crying at night was common, which kept everyone else awake, which increased irritability, creating a cycle of sleeplessness and tension. Now let's talk about the class segregation, because it wasn't subtle and it wasn't accidental. The Titanic was designed to keep classes separated. Gates and locked doors enforced this separation. Third-class passengers were restricted to their areas. First and second class were restricted to theirs. The barriers were physical and social. The gates between third class and the rest of the ship were locked during most of the voyage. This wasn't officially to keep third-class passengers in. It was officially to comply with immigration law, which required that steerage passengers be kept separate to prevent the spread of disease. The reality was that the gates kept poor immigrants away from wealthy passengers, who didn't want to see or interact with them. You could see the gates if you ventured toward the upper decks. Metal barriers with locks, staffed by stewards, who politely but firmly turned back anyone without a first or second class ticket. The message was clear: your money bought you access to specific spaces, and those spaces didn't include anywhere nice. The promenade decks with comfortable chairs, the libraries, the smoking rooms with leather furniture, the lounges with orchestras, all were above you, literally and figuratively, separated by locked gates and social convention. The psychological effect of this segregation was complex. Some third-class passengers accepted it as natural. The way things were, rich people having better accommodations, was just how the world worked. Others resented it. Seeing the locked gates as symbolic of the class barriers, they were fleeing in Europe, realizing that even in the middle of the Atlantic, inequality followed them. The few times third-class passengers caught glimpses of first-class areas, the contrast was shocking. Carpeted corridors instead of bare metal, wood paneling and art instead of white paint, space and privacy instead of crowding. The realization that people upstairs were living in luxury, while you were crammed into a metal box with 7 strangers, was radicalizing for some. The promise of America was equality. The reality of the Titanic was a floating class system, as rigid as anything in Europe. But you had hope. That is what made it tolerable. The discomfort, the cramping, the noise, the smell, the segregation, all of it was temporary. 1 week of suffering for a lifetime of opportunity in America. You'd endure worse for that prize. The ticket to New York was a ticket to possibility. You just had to survive the journey. And for the first 4 days, survival seemed guaranteed. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. The newspapers, the White Star Line, the crew, all repeated the same message. This ship couldn't sink. It was the safest vessel ever built, with watertight compartments and modern engineering. You were safer on the Titanic than you'd be on land. The statistics proved it. Except the statistics were about to become irrelevant, because on the 14th of April, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., everything changed in an instant that most third-class passengers didn't even notice immediately. The collision with the iceberg was felt differently depending on where you were on the ship. In first class, it was described as a slight shudder, like the ship had rolled over 1,000 marbles. Mild enough that most first-class passengers didn't even wake up, or if they did, rolled over and went back to sleep. In third class, especially in the bow, where many single men were housed, the collision was more noticeable. You felt a grinding vibration, heard a scraping sound, felt the ship shudder and list slightly. Not violent, not dramatic, but present. Noticeable enough that you sat up in your bunk, wondering what had happened, but not alarming enough to panic. Most third-class passengers didn't leave their cabins immediately. The collision happened late at night, after 11 p.m., when most people were in bed or preparing for bed. You'd felt a bump. So what? Ships bump into things. Waves. Debris. Who knew what was out there in the darkness? You were tired. The bunks were uncomfortable, but you'd finally gotten semi-comfortable. Getting up meant getting cold. Getting dressed. Climbing stairs to find out information that probably wasn't important. Anyway, some did investigate immediately. The curious ones, the nervous ones, the ones who couldn't sleep anyway. They climbed up to the deck, asked crew members what happened, and were told nothing was wrong. A minor collision with an iceberg. No damage. Nothing to worry about. Go back to bed. This was partially true and partially lie. The crew members giving this information genuinely believed it. Mostly. They'd been told by superiors that the damage was manageable. The Titanic was unsinkable. A little iceberg couldn't hurt it. This message was passed down the chain, steward to steward, until it reached the third-class passengers asking questions. Everything is fine. Go back to bed. Nothing to see here. You went back to bed. Or most people did. The suspicious ones stayed up, uneasy, feeling like something was wrong, even though they couldn't articulate what. They stood on deck, watching, noticing small things. The way the ship was sitting slightly lower in the water. The way the crew members were moving with more urgency than their words suggested. The way the engines had stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence, broken only by voices, and the ocean. Below, in third-class cabins, most people were still sleeping or trying to sleep. The collision had woken many, but without immediate alarming follow-up, they'd settled back down. Children who'd cried were being soothed. Adults who'd sat up were lying back down. The ship was full of people trying to reclaim the sleep that had been interrupted, not knowing that they'd never sleep again. That, for many of them, this was the last time they'd be warm and dry. About 30 minutes after the collision, things started changing in ways that were harder to ignore. The ship was listing more noticeably. The bow was definitely lower. Water was visible on the lower decks. Not flooding, but present. Creeping up in places it shouldn't be. And the crew's attitude shifted from reassuring to concern to actively trying to move people. The stewards started going through third-class areas, knocking on cabin doors, telling people to put on life jackets and go up on deck. Not yelling, not panicking, but firm. Life jackets on. Go up on deck. Now, the tone suggested urgency without admitting danger. This was a precaution, they said, probably unnecessary, but regulations required it. Just go up on deck with your life jacket. Bring your valuables. The captain's orders. The life jackets were stored in the cabins, in some cases under the bunks, in other cases in lockers in the corridors. They were canvas and cork contraptions that looked like vests, designed to keep your head above water by providing buoyancy around your torso. They were awkward and uncomfortable, making movement difficult. But you put one on because the steward said to. Getting your family organised was chaotic. Children needed help with their life jackets. The straps were confusing. The sizing was off. The children were scared and asking questions you couldn't answer because you didn't know the answers. Why are we putting these on? Is the ship sinking? Are we going to die? You didn't know. The steward said it is a precaution. So you repeated that. It is a precaution. Everything is fine. We're just being careful. The corridors filled with people, all heading toward the stairs, all wearing life jackets, all trying to follow instructions while fighting the sense that something was very wrong. The ship's list was more pronounced now, making walking awkward. You had to lean slightly to maintain balance. Objects were sliding across tables. Water was sloshing at the bottom of some stairwells. The stairs going up were metal and steep, difficult to climb in normal circumstances, harder in a crowd, while wearing a life jacket, while carrying children, while the ship tilted. You joined the queue of people climbing, moving slowly because there were hundreds of you trying to use the same narrow staircases simultaneously. Bottlenecks formed. People pushed. Children cried. The climb that should have taken 2 minutes took 10, then 15 as more people joined the crowd. And then you reached a gate, one of the locked gates separating third class from second class. The gate that was supposed to be unlocked in emergencies. The gate that was currently locked with a steward standing guard. The steward was trying to maintain order. He was checking that everyone had life jackets. He was sorting people by some system that wasn't clear. Families here, single men there. He wasn't opening the gate. Not yet. Wait here, he said. Orderly lines. We'll let you through shortly. Just wait. You waited. Because what else could you do? The gate was locked. The steward had the key. Behind you. More people kept arriving, filling the corridor. creating pressure from the growing crowd. In front of you, the locked gate, and below you, somewhere down in the darkness of the lower decks, water was rising. The waiting was surreal. You were standing in a crowded corridor, wearing a life jacket, holding your children, being told to wait patiently while the ship listed further and further to the side. The absurdity of it was striking. Your life was in danger, the ship was clearly sinking, and you were being told to form an orderly queue. Some people didn't wait, they tried to go around, looking for other staircases, other routes to the upper decks. The Titanic was a maze if you didn't know it. Third-class passengers had been confined to specific areas for the entire voyage. Most didn't know alternative routes. They wandered into dead ends, locked doors, more gates. The ship was designed to keep them in their area, and that design was now trapping them. Others argued with the steward. "Open the gate. Let us through. The ship is sinking. We need to get to the boats." The steward repeated his instructions. "Wait here, orderly fashion. You'll be let through. Just wait." His job was to prevent panic, maintain order, follow procedures. The procedures said to keep third class orderly and controlled. So he did his job, even as the ship sank beneath him. Eventually, the gates opened. Not all of them, not all at once, but gradually, as the crew realized the situation was genuinely desperate. Stewards unlocked gates, directed people through, tried to guide the crowd toward the boat deck. But the delay had cost time. Precious minutes had been lost waiting for orderly procedures, while the ship listed further, and the boats began launching. The climb from third class to the boat deck was 7 decks. 7 flights of steep metal stairs, through corridors that grew progressively more crowded as third class joined with second class. All heading upward, all racing against the rising water and the dropping stern. The physical effort of climbing 7 flights while wearing a life jacket, while carrying or dragging children, while weakened by days of inadequate food and poor sleep, was enormous. You were winded after 3 flights. Your legs burned after 5. By 7 you were gasping, dizzy, fighting the urge to stop and rest, because you knew stopping meant dying. And all around you people were falling behind. The elderly couldn't keep the pace. The sick couldn't climb at all. Mothers with multiple small children made it up 1 flight before realizing they couldn't carry all their children simultaneously and had to choose. Some families were separated in the crowd. Children swept away in the press of bodies, parents screaming names that were lost in the chaos. You finally reached the boat deck. Cold air hit you like a slap. The temperature was below freezing. The wind was bitter, and you were wearing whatever you'd hastily pulled on in your cabin, which was inadequate for standing on an open deck in the North Atlantic in April. But the cold was a secondary concern. The primary concern was getting into a lifeboat. Except the lifeboats were already launching. You could see them, davits swinging out, boats being lowered, officers shouting orders, crew members helping passengers climb in. But the passengers being helped were mostly first and second class. Well-dressed women in furs and jewellery, men in evening clothes who'd been in the lounges when the collision happened. They'd had a head start. They'd been on the boat deck for 30 minutes already. And there were only so many boats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, with a total capacity of 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on board. The math didn't work, even if every boat filled to capacity, which they didn't. But you didn't know the numbers. You just knew there were boats, and you needed to be in one. The crew were prioritizing women and children first, which made sense in theory, but was complicated in practice. First-class women and children first meant something different than all women and children first. The class hierarchy persisted even in the evacuation. First-class women were escorted to boats. Third-class women were trying to find boats while navigating an unfamiliar deck in the dark and cold. The officers controlling the boats were overwhelmed and inconsistent. Some enforced women and children first rigidly, refusing to let men even approach. Others filled boats with whoever was nearby when it was time to launch. Some boats left half empty because officers believed they couldn't safely lower a fully loaded boat and planned to fill them from the water. A plan that made no sense and killed people through its incompetence. You pushed through the crowd, trying to get close to a boat. Any boat you held your children's hands, terrified of losing them in the chaos. You shouted to be heard over the noise, the screaming, the orders, the steam venting from the funnels with a deafening roar. The deck was tilting more noticeably now, walking uphill toward the stern, downhill toward the bow. The list was severe enough that objects were sliding. Some families made it into boats. The lucky ones. The ones who reached the deck earlier, the ones who pushed hardest, the ones who caught an officer's attention. You'd see them being loaded, Women and children climbing over the rail, being helped into the swaying boat, disappearing into the darkness as the boat descended. Others didn't make it. The boats filled, or appeared to fill, and were lowered while hundreds still waited. You'd watch a boat with empty seats disappear toward the water, while you stood 10 feet away, unable to reach it, unable to convince anyone to wait, unable to do anything but watch your survival boat leave without you. The timeline of the sinking was roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes from collision to the ship's final plunge. But those 2 hours and 40 minutes were not evenly experienced. First-class passengers had nearly the full time to evacuate. Third-class passengers had maybe an hour once they finally reached the boat deck, and many had less. As the boats dwindled, the panic increased. The crowd on the deck grew more desperate. People who'd been orderly began pushing. Stewards who'd been maintaining calm began showing fear themselves. The reality that there weren't enough boats became undeniable. Simple math. More people than boats meant some people weren't getting into boats. Were you going to be some people? The men were told explicitly that they couldn't board. Women and children only. Full stop. Men who tried to climb into boats were physically removed. Some officers drew guns, threatening to shoot any man who rushed a boat. The threats were sometimes carried out. Shots were fired into the air, possibly into people. Accounts varied. The maintenance of order through force became necessary as survival instincts overrode social conventions. For third-class men, this meant certain death. You'd been kept below by locked gates until most boats were gone. You'd climbed 7 flights to reach the deck. You'd watched boats leave half empty. And now you were told you couldn't board because of your gender. Your wife and children might make it into a boat. You wouldn't say goodbye. Make it fast. The boats are leaving. Some third-class men managed to board anyway. They jumped into boats as they were lowered. They hid among women. They ignored orders and climbed in during the chaos when officers weren't looking. The survival instinct overrode obedience. But most followed the rules, stayed back, helped women and children into boats, and accepted their fate with whatever dignity they could muster. The last boats left around 2:05 a.m. After that, if you weren't in a boat, you were staying on the ship. Over 1,500 people were still aboard when the last boat cleared the davits. The deck was crowded with the damned, people who knew they were going to die in the next few minutes, and were waiting for it to happen. The stern was rising now as the bow sank deeper. The angle was steep enough that standing was difficult. People clung to railings, to deck chairs, to each other. Some were praying, some were crying, some were silent, shock and disbelief rendering them mute. Some were still looking for solutions that didn't exist, trying doors, looking for boats that weren't there, refusing to accept that this was how it ended. The water was rising up the deck, visible in the darkness, as a black line creeping higher and higher. Cold beyond comprehension, -2 degrees Celsius salt water, cold enough that survival time was measured in minutes. The water climbed the deck foot by foot, swallowing deck chairs, then cargo cranes, then ventilation shafts. Inevitable and unstoppable. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the lights went out. The electrical system failed, plunging the ship into total darkness. The screaming intensified. Without light, people couldn't see the water, couldn't see each other, couldn't orient themselves in space. The darkness was disorienting and terrifying, removing the last sense of control. And then the ship broke. The stress of the bow being underwater and the stern being in the air became too much for the hull. The Titanic snapped roughly between the third and fourth funnels, a catastrophic structural failure that sounded like an explosion. Metal tearing, rivets popping. The sound of the world's largest ship breaking in half was heard miles away. The bow section sank immediately, dragging down everyone still on it. The stern section settled back into the water, briefly, almost floating, giving a moment of false hope before it too began to sink. The stern rose again, this time almost vertically, standing on end with its propellers in the air. Hundreds of people clinging to railings and sliding down the deck into the water. The final plunge of the stern was quick. It went vertical, hung there for a few seconds, then slid beneath the surface, creating a massive suction that pulled people and debris. Under the time was approximately 2:20 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. The people in the water were immediately in agony. The temperature caused cold water shock, an involuntary gasping reflex that made drowning instant for some. For those who managed to control the shock, the cold began killing them through hypothermia. Core body temperature drops rapidly in water that cold. You have maybe 15 to 30 minutes before you lose consciousness, or maybe 45 minutes before your heart stops. The life jackets kept you floating, which was both a mercy and a cruelty. Mercy because you didn't have to expend energy treading water. Cruelty because you stayed conscious longer, aware of your dying, feeling every stage of hypothermia as your body shut down. The screaming lasted about 15 minutes. Hundreds of voices calling for help, crying, moaning, creating a sound that survivors described as haunting, inhuman, a collective death wail that filled the night. And then the screaming faded as people lost consciousness and died. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The lifeboats were nearby, maybe 100 yards away in most cases, floating safely, partially filled, with room for more people. The people in the water could see them, could swim toward them, could beg to be pulled in. Most boats refused. The people in the boats were afraid that swimmers would swamp the boats, capsizing them and killing everyone. So they rowed away from the screaming, ignoring the pleas, saving themselves at the cost of others. Only one boat went back. Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back about 20 minutes after the sinking, after waiting for the screaming to stop, so they wouldn't be overwhelmed by desperate swimmers. They pulled 4 people from the water alive, 4 out of hundreds. The rest had died while lifeboats with empty seats floated nearby. The survival rate for third-class passengers was 25%. For third-class men, it was 16%. For third-class women and children, it was slightly better, but still worse than first and second class. The locked gates, the delayed evacuation, the segregated areas, the class hierarchy, all contributed to a death rate that was inversely proportional to ticket price. Your £7 ticket bought you a 3 in 4 chance of death. Specific people from third class become more tragic when you know their stories. The Goodwin family, 8 people, parents and 6 children, travelling from England to New York. All 8 drowned. Not one survived. Their bodies, except for the youngest child, were never found. The youngest, Sydney, was recovered and buried in Halifax, but misidentified for decades until DNA testing in 2002 revealed his identity. The family died together, locked below decks or unable to reach boats, their entire existence erased in one night. The Sage family, 11 people, parents and 9 children, the largest family on board. All 11 died. They boarded at Southampton, with everything they owned converted into ticket money. They were going to Florida to farm, to build a new life in sunshine and opportunity. None of them reached shore. Their bodies were never recovered. 11 people who ceased to exist in one moment, leaving nothing behind but ticket records and photographs. The Rice family, 6 people, a mother and 5 children. The father had already emigrated to America, working to save money for his family's passage. He succeeded, sent money, they boarded the Titanic. All 6 died. The father, waiting in New York, expecting to meet them, instead learned he'd lost his entire family. Can you imagine? Working for years to bring them to America, finally succeeding, and instead of reunion, receiving a telegram saying they're all dead. Hundreds of similar stories. Families travelling together, dying together. Newlyweds starting married life, ending it on the same night. Children travelling alone to join parents in America, drowning before seeing them again. Each person represented hopes, dreams, relationships, potential futures. All of it ended in freezing water, because they couldn't afford a more expensive ticket. The survivors from third class faced different challenges than first and second class survivors. Many had lost everything: family members, possessions, money, documentation. They'd spent everything on the ticket. What little they'd brought was at the bottom of the Atlantic. They arrived in New York with nothing. No money, no luggage. Only the clothes they'd been wearing when they reached the boat deck. The survivors were picked up by the Carpathia, a ship that received the distress call and arrived around 4 a.m., about an hour and a half after the sinking. The rescue operation took hours, the lifeboats rowing to the Carpathia one by one, passengers climbing rope ladders or being hauled up in slings. By the time the last boat was picked up, it was mid-morning. The Carpathia's passengers gave up their cabins, their clothes, their comfort to accommodate the survivors. But even so, resources were strained. Over 700 survivors on a ship designed for many fewer. Third-class survivors were housed wherever space could be found, in the dining saloons, in the corridors, on deck, traumatized, grieving in shock, with nowhere private to process what had happened. The journey to New York took 3 days. 3 days of survivors grappling with trauma, searching for missing family members, hoping against hope that another ship had picked up additional survivors. It hadn't. The dead were dead. The realization sank in slowly, denial giving way to grief, in waves that crashed over survivors at random moments. The arrival in New York was chaotic. Crowds at the pier, journalists trying to get stories, families searching for survivors, officials trying to process immigration paperwork. The third-class survivors were sent to Ellis Island for the immigration processing they'd hoped to avoid. Traumatized, impoverished, with no possessions, they went through the medical inspections and interviews they'd already passed once before boarding. Some were rejected, after surviving the sinking, after losing family, after enduring hypothermia and grief and trauma. Some survivors were denied entry to the United States for medical or documentation reasons, and sent back to Europe. The cruelty of surviving the Titanic only to be rejected at Ellis Island is difficult to comprehend, but it happened. Not many, but some. Each case a personal tragedy piled on top of collective tragedy. The survivors who were admitted faced rebuilding lives from nothing. Charities provided some assistance. The Red Cross helped. Individuals donated money. But most third-class survivors were on their own, starting over in a country where they didn't speak the language, with no money, no support system. They took whatever work they could find, lived in tenements, survived through willpower and luck. The psychological trauma of third-class survivors was profound and largely unaddressed. PTSD wasn't a recognized diagnosis. Therapy wasn't available to poor immigrants. They carried their trauma privately, nightmares about drowning, guilt about surviving. When family didn't, flashbacks triggered by cold water or the sound of ships' horns. Many never spoke about it, the pain too great to articulate. The compensation for third-class passengers was minimal. The White Star Line paid out claims based on ticket class. First-class passengers received substantial settlements. Third-class passengers received a fraction, often just enough to replace the possessions they'd lost. Nothing for the family members who died. The legal system valued lives based on economic class. A first-class death was worth tens of thousands. A third-class death was worth hundreds. The inequality of life extended to the inequality of death. The investigations into the sinking focused largely on the experiences of first- and second-class passengers. The testimony heard by the British and American inquiries came disproportionately from officers and wealthy passengers. Third-class survivors testified, but their voices were marginalized. The language barriers, the class biases of the investigators, the lack of social standing, all meant their experiences were less documented, less believed, less valued. The locked gates became a point of controversy. Third-class survivors testified that gates were locked, that they were kept below, that stewards prevented them from reaching the boats. The White Star Line denied this, claiming all gates were opened as soon as the emergency became clear. The truth was somewhere in between, or rather everywhere on the spectrum. Some gates opened quickly, some opened late. Some may not have opened at all. The experiences varied, but enough survivors reported locked gates that the accusation stuck. The class discrimination in the evacuation became undeniable once the statistics were analysed. 62% of first-class passengers survived. 41% of second-class survived. 25% of third-class survived. The disparity couldn't be explained by location or chance. The system was designed to save wealthy passengers first, and it worked exactly as designed. The Titanic sinking proved that even in a disaster, some lives mattered more than others. The legacy of the third-class passengers is one of forgotten tragedy. The first-class passengers are famous: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss. Their stories are told and retold, their heroism and sacrifice celebrated. The third-class passengers are largely anonymous, their names unknown except to researchers and descendants. They died in the largest numbers but received the least attention. This anonymity isn't accidental. It reflects the same class bias that killed them. Their lives mattered less when they lived, so their deaths matter less in memory. The narrative of the Titanic focuses on the wealthy, the famous, the officers making heroic decisions. The immigrants dying below decks are context, background, numbers rather than name. But each was a person. Each had a story. The young Irish woman leaving home for the first time, terrified but hopeful. The Syrian couple starting married life with dreams of prosperity. The Swedish families seeking farmland and freedom. The Chinese men travelling as labourers, barred from most immigration, but allowed as seamen and workers. All of them had hopes, fears, families, potential. All of it ended because they couldn't afford a better ticket. The third-class experience on the Titanic represents everything wrong with early 20th century class systems. The segregation, the discrimination, the assumption that poor lives mattered less. The locked gates were literal and metaphorical, keeping people in their place, ensuring that even in crisis, the hierarchy was maintained. Those at the bottom stayed at the bottom, even as the ship sank. The survivors carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Survivors' guilt is common after any disaster, but for third-class survivors, it was compounded by the knowledge that their survival was partially luck, partially being female or a child, partially being able-bodied enough to climb the stairs fast enough. The people who died were often the elderly, the sick, the mothers with too many children to carry, the people whose circumstances made survival impossible. Living with that knowledge corroded many survivors from the inside. The children who survived but lost parents faced particularly difficult futures. Orphaned, penniless in a foreign country, they were placed in orphanages or taken in by relatives if they had any. Some thrived, resilient children building lives from tragedy. Others struggled, the trauma stunting their development, the loss too great to overcome. The youngest ones had no memory of the event, but carried its effects through their entire lives. Shaped by a disaster, they didn't consciously remember. The long-term health effects of surviving the sinking were significant. The hypothermia, even in survivors who didn't spend long in the water, caused lasting damage. Frostbite, nerve damage, weakened immune systems from the cold shock. Many survivors had chronic health problems that stemmed directly from the night of the sinking. The cold water didn't just kill immediately. It damaged survivors for the rest of their lives. The mental health effects were worse and more enduring. Anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, all were common among survivors. The nightmares never fully stopped for many. The fear of water, of ships, of any situation that reminded them of the sinking persisted. Some survivors never set foot on a ship again. Others returned to the sea, forcing themselves to overcome the trauma. But the fear remained underneath, manageable but present. The families of third-class victims faced financial, as well as emotional devastation. Many had been the primary breadwinners, their deaths leaving families destitute. Widows with children had limited employment options in the early 20th century. Orphaned children became burdens on extended families or communities. The ripple effects of each death extended outward, affecting not just immediate family, but entire social networks. The communities that the third-class passengers came from were disproportionately affected. Small villages in Ireland lost multiple families to the sinking. Parishes in Italy held masses for dozens of their members who died. The Titanic's third class wasn't just individuals. It was a cross-section of European and Middle Eastern immigrant communities, and the losses hit those communities hard, creating collective trauma that lasted generations. The Titanic disaster changed immigration, patterns, and regulations. The visibility of the tragedy, the clear evidence that conditions for immigrants were deadly, led to some reforms. Ships were required to have sufficient lifeboats for all passengers. Lifeboat drills became mandatory. Radio communication protocols were established. The changes came too late for the Titanic's victims, but potentially saved lives on future voyages. But the fundamental inequalities weren't addressed. First-class passengers continued to receive better safety equipment and accommodations. Third-class passengers continued to be treated as cargo. The reforms addressed the most egregious problems, but left the class system intact. Immigrants in the decades after the Titanic still travelled in crowded, uncomfortable, unsafe conditions. They just had more lifeboats while doing it. The memory of the Titanic has been sanitized and romanticized over the decades. The 1997 film popularized a love story between a first-class woman and a third-class man. Beautiful and tragic, but not representative of actual third-class experience. Real third-class passengers weren't secretly mingling with first class. They were locked below, denied access, treated as inferior. The romance obscures the systemic inequality that killed them. The wreck of the Titanic, discovered in 1985, provided physical evidence of the disaster, but also raised ethical questions about disturbing a mass grave. Artifacts recovered from the wreck include personal effects from third-class passengers, shoes, combs, luggage, the small possessions of people who lost everything. Displaying these in museums is controversial. Are we honouring the victims or exploiting their tragedy? The answer probably depends on how it is done, but the question itself reveals our ongoing discomfort with class and death. The third-class passengers of the Titanic deserve to be remembered not as statistics or background characters in someone else's story, but as individuals who had lives, dreams, families. They deserve to be remembered as victims of a system that valued them less because they were poor. They deserve to be remembered as people who died preventable deaths because the ship didn't have enough lifeboats and the lifeboats it had were filled first with people who could afford better tickets. And here is what really stays with you if you understand the third-class experience. It is not the romance of the doomed ship or the bravery of the band playing as it sank. It is the locked gates. It is the stewards telling people to wait while the ship sank beneath them. It is the mothers trying to carry multiple children up 7 flights of stairs. It is the men being told they can't board the half-empty boats. It is the 25% survival rate compared to 62% for first class. It is the fact that your chance of survival was directly proportional to your ticket price. That is what the Titanic was. A floating class system where money bought not just comfort but life itself. And when it sank, it proved what everyone already knew but preferred not to say. Some lives are valued more than others, and the difference is calculated in pounds sterling. The third-class passengers paid everything they had for a ticket to a new life. They got a ticket to an early death instead. They died in the cold Atlantic water, or in the corridors trying to reach the deck, or in the stern as it went vertical and slid under. They died because they were poor, and the system was designed to save the rich first. And their deaths are a reminder that inequality kills, that class barriers are literal barriers, and that injustice doesn't stop just because you are drowning. So when you think about the Titanic, don't think about the romance, or the heroism, or the inevitability of the tragedy. Think about the third-class passengers waiting at the locked gate. Think about the children who could have fit in the half-empty lifeboats. Think about the families who died together because they were too poor to die separately. Think about the system that said some people mattered less. Because that is the real story of the Titanic. And it is a story that is still being written in every disaster, where the poor die first, and the rich escape to safety. But let's go deeper into the actual experience of those first few days at sea, before the disaster. Because understanding the daily reality of third class makes the tragedy even more profound. You need to know what life was like on the ship to understand why survival was so difficult when it started sinking. The wake-up call in third class wasn't gentle. There was no steward quietly knocking on your door offering morning tea. You woke because the engine noise changed pitch, or because other passengers started moving around, or because the cold and discomfort made continued sleep impossible. The metal walls transmitted every sound, footsteps in corridors, doors slamming, pipes rattling, the constant thrumming vibration of the engines that never stopped. Morning ablutions were a competitive sport. The 2 bathrooms for 700 plus people meant that if you wanted any hope of using a sink or toilet without a massive queue, you needed to go early. Very early. The smart passengers woke at 5 or 6 a.m., well before breakfast, to claim bathroom space before the rush. The ones who slept until 7 a.m. found themselves waiting in lines that stretched down corridors, holding their frustration and their bladders simultaneously. The water situation was particularly frustrating. The cold salt water in your cabin basin was barely adequate for washing your face and hands. A proper wash required going to the bathroom and using the limited hot water available there. But hot water ran out quickly when hundreds of people were trying to use it simultaneously. If you arrived after 7 a.m., you got lukewarm at best, cold at worst. Bathing was a luxury that required strategic timing and patience. Women faced additional challenges with personal hygiene. Managing menstruation on a ship with no privacy and limited washing facilities was a nightmare. The products available in 1912 were primitive, cloth pads that needed washing and reusing, or nothing at all. Washing menstrual cloths in a shared sink with a line of people waiting behind you wasn't an option. Privacy for such personal matters didn't exist. Women improvised, suffered in silence, and dealt with situations that would have been merely uncomfortable on land, but became degrading at sea. The clothing situation was equally problematic. You'd brought maybe 2 complete outfits. One you wore, one was packed. Laundry wasn't really possible. Some passengers tried to wash small items in their cabin basins, using precious fresh water they'd saved from drinking rations. The items would drip dry in the cabin, adding moisture to the already damp air, creating a musty smell that mixed with all the other unpleasant odors. Seasickness affected many passengers, especially in the early days of the voyage. The Titanic was large and relatively stable, but movement was still present. The bow and stern, where third class was located, moved more than the middle, where first class resided. You'd feel the ship pitch and roll, subtle but persistent. For people who'd never been on a ship before, which described most third-class passengers, the motion was enough to cause nausea. Being seasick in third class was particularly miserable. You were already in a cramped cabin with thin mattresses and no ventilation. Add nausea and vomiting to the mix, and it became hellish. The cabin had no toilet. You had to make it to the bathroom, down the corridor, while dizzy and nauseous, hoping you'd make it before vomiting. Many didn't. The corridors saw their share of accidents, which stewards would clean up with varying degrees of thoroughness. The children in third class became both entertainment and frustration for adult passengers. During the day, children would run through corridors, playing games, being loud. As children do. This was fine when you were in a good mood, when you were tired, sick, or dealing with your own problems. The constant noise of other people's children became grating. But discipline was difficult. The parents were stressed. The space was too small for effective time. Outs, and the children were bored, with nowhere to go and nothing to do. The teenage passengers were in a particularly awkward situation. Too old to be entertained by children's games, too young to fully participate in adult socializing. They wandered the third-class areas looking for something, anything, to alleviate the boredom. Some found friends among other teenagers. Others just suffered through the voyage counting days until arrival. The elderly passengers struggled with the physical demands of ship life. The stairs were difficult for those with bad joints or weak legs. Getting from the cabins to the dining room required climbing stairs. Getting to the deck required more stairs. Everything required stairs, and they were steep metal stairs without much in the way of handrails or assistance. Elderly passengers who needed help became burdens on family members who were already stressed and tired. The disabled passengers, the few who were allowed to board at all, faced near impossible conditions. A person in a wheelchair couldn't navigate the stairs. A blind person couldn't navigate the maze of corridors. The deaf couldn't hear announcements or warnings. The ship wasn't designed with accessibility in mind because disabled people weren't expected to emigrate in significant numbers. The few who did faced daily struggles that made basic functions exhausting. The language barriers created their own problems. Third class was a babble of languages: English, Irish, Gaelic, Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, Italian, Arabic, Armenian, Chinese, and more. You might share a cabin with someone whose language you didn't speak at all. Communication happened through gestures, pointing, showing. Misunderstandings were common, and sometimes led to conflicts over trivial things that couldn't be explained or resolved through words. Meal times highlighted the language issues. The servers spoke English. The menus were in English. If you didn't speak English, you didn't know what you were ordering. You pointed at what others ordered, or you ate whatever was put in front of you, hoping it wasn't something your religion or culture forbade. Jewish passengers trying to keep kosher, Muslim passengers avoiding pork, vegetarians hoping to find something meatless, all struggled with a system that didn't accommodate dietary restrictions. The religious diversity of third class created both community and tension. Catholic passengers from Ireland and Italy found common ground in shared faith despite language differences. They'd gather for impromptu prayers. The Latin words familiar even when spoken conversation was impossible. Jewish passengers found each other and created small communities within the larger third-class population. Orthodox Christians, Protestants, Muslims, all carved out spaces for their practices in a ship that provided no religious accommodations for third class. Friday prayers for Muslim passengers happened wherever space could be found. There was no mosque, no designated prayer area. They'd find a quiet corner of a corridor or a section of deck and pray, while other passengers walked around them. The same for Jewish passengers keeping Sabbath. The ship didn't stop for religious observances. You fit your faith around the ship's schedule, not the other way around. Food restrictions meant some passengers were essentially on forced diets. If the served meal contained pork and you didn't eat pork, you went hungry. If Friday meant fish but you needed to avoid fish, too bad. The ship provided what it provided. Cultural and religious dietary needs were your problem, not theirs. Passengers who'd brought their own food from home, dried meats or bread or other preserved items, would supplement the ship's meals with their own provisions to meet dietary requirements. The gambling that happened in third class was both entertainment and exploitation. Card games were constant in the general room and some cabins. Some were friendly, small stakes, just passing time. Others were serious, with men betting money they couldn't afford to lose. Professional gamblers travelled in third class, specifically to prey on naive immigrants who didn't understand the games well or were too trusting of fellow passengers. The ship's crew were supposed to prevent gambling, but enforcement was inconsistent. In first class, gambling was regulated, but allowed in the smoking rooms with proper decorum. In third class, it was technically forbidden but widely ignored as long as it didn't cause disturbances. The double standard was clear. Wealthy people gambling was sophisticated entertainment. Poor people gambling was vice. Drinking was another area where class distinctions appeared. First-class passengers had access to wine lists, champagne, fine spirits. Second class had a bar with decent selection. Third class had a small bar with limited cheap options. And even those were expensive relative to passenger means. A beer cost 4 pence, when you had maybe £2 or £3 to last you until reaching America and finding work. 4 pence was a significant expense. But men drank anyway. Stress, anxiety about the future, boredom, social pressure, all contributed to drinking as a coping mechanism. The third-class bar saw regular business from men trying to ease their worries with alcohol. Some drank responsibly. Others drank away money their families needed. Arguments over drinking were common. Wives confronting husbands, who'd spent money they couldn't afford, on drinks they didn't need. The smoking was ubiquitous. In 1912, smoking was normal for men and not uncommon for women, though women usually didn't smoke in public. The third-class areas reeked of tobacco smoke constantly. Men smoked pipes, cigarettes, cigars if they could afford them. The smoke mixed with all the other smells, body odor, food, salt air, engine oil. The combination was pungent and inescapable. Non-smokers suffered but had no smoke. Free areas to retreat to. The health problems that emerged during even a short voyage were concerning. Respiratory infections spread quickly in the crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. Coughs, colds, flu-like symptoms appeared and spread from person to person through shared air and shared facilities. Children got sick first and worst, then adults. By day 3 or 4, the sound of coughing echoed constantly through third-class corridors. The ship's doctor was theoretically available to all passengers, but in practice, he spent most of his time attending to first class. Third-class passengers with health issues had to request to see the doctor, and unless the situation was urgent, they'd wait. The doctor would make rounds through third class occasionally, but his visits were brief and perfunctory. Complex medical issues weren't addressed. You got basic assessment, and maybe some medicine, and that was it. The medicine provided was minimal: aspirin for pain, some kind of tonic for stomach issues, bandages for minor injuries. Anything more serious, and you were told to wait until reaching New York where proper medical care was available. Suffer through it, basically. A week of suffering until landing seemed manageable, unless you had a serious condition that deteriorated during that week. Dental problems were particularly agonizing. If you had a toothache, there was essentially nothing to be done. The ship had no dentist. Pain relief was limited. You suffered through throbbing dental pain for days with no relief, except whatever alcohol you could afford to drink yourself numb. Several passengers dealt with tooth abscesses that became serious infections, poisoning their systems, while they waited helplessly for the voyage to end. The interpersonal drama of 700 people in close quarters for days was inevitable and exhausting. Arguments erupted over everything: noise levels, children's behavior, suspected theft, use of shared facilities, accidentally bumping into each other in narrow corridors. The stress of emigration, the discomfort of conditions, the uncertainty of the future, all created short tempers and reduced patience. Theft was a real concern. Personal possessions were vulnerable. The cabins locked, but crew had master keys, and not all crew were trustworthy. Bags stored under bunks could be rifled through while you were at meals or on deck. Money, jewelry, any valuables were at risk. Passengers developed strategies: sleeping with money hidden on their bodies, never leaving valuables unattended, being suspicious of everyone. The paranoia wasn't unfounded. Theft definitely occurred. Items went missing. Money disappeared, proving theft was nearly impossible. The crew didn't investigate seriously. The attitude was that you should have guarded your possessions better. If you were foolish enough to leave something valuable accessible, losing it was your own fault. Victim blaming before the term existed. The sexual tensions and harassment were present but rarely discussed. Young women traveling alone or in small groups faced unwanted attention from men. Comments, staring, sometimes physical approaches that crossed lines. The stewards were supposed to maintain propriety, but they couldn't be everywhere. And some stewards were part of the problem, using their authority to pressure vulnerable women. The physical layout of the ship, with men's quarters separated from women's quarters, was supposed to prevent impropriety. But people found ways. Couples engaged in various levels of intimacy, wherever they could find privacy, which was nowhere. so they made do with semi-privacy in dark corners of decks or unused corridors. The crew would break up anything too obvious, but they couldn't prevent everything. The marriages that happened on board were usually pre-arranged. Couples who'd married by proxy or were travelling to join fiancés would finally meet on the ship or shortly after. The awkwardness of these situations played out in public because there was no privacy. You'd see newlyweds trying to get to know each other while sharing a cabin with 4 other people. Romance, in those circumstances, was difficult to maintain. The friendships that formed during the voyage were intense, but often short-lived. You'd bond with fellow passengers over shared circumstances, exchange life stories, promise to stay in touch after reaching America. But once the ship landed, people scattered to different cities and different lives. The friendships made at sea rarely survived the transition to land. You'd remember them, but you'd likely never see those people again. The children's friendships were even more poignant. Kids would become inseparable during the voyage, playing together constantly, creating imaginary games and shared adventures. They didn't understand that arrival in New York meant separation, probably permanent. Parents would watch their children bond with other children knowing those friendships had an expiration date in a few days. The music in third class came from the passengers themselves. Unlike first class with its professional orchestra, third class entertainment was whatever passengers could provide. Someone with a harmonica, someone who could sing, someone with a fiddle. Impromptu performances would happen in the general room. Passengers from different countries sharing their traditional songs, creating a multicultural concert that was probably the best part of the voyage. The Irish passengers were particularly musical. Irish songs would fill the general room in the evenings, jigs and reels and ballads that everyone recognized even if they didn't know the words. Other passengers would clap along, tap their feet, feel briefly connected through music, even when language divided them. The music was a reminder that humans everywhere find joy in rhythm and melody, even in difficult circumstances. The Italian passengers brought their own musical traditions. Opera arias sung by men with untrained but powerful voices. Folk songs from Naples or Sicily that made older passengers weep with homesickness. The music connected them to the homes they were leaving, gave them a way to process the enormous change they were undertaking. The Scandinavian passengers had their own songs, usually quieter, more melancholic. Songs about the sea, about leaving home, about uncertain futures. Sung in Swedish or Norwegian, the melodies had a haunting quality that transcended language, communicating sadness and hope simultaneously. The few Chinese passengers in third class were mostly men, traveling as laborers or pursuing economic opportunities. They faced additional discrimination, even among third-class passengers. Racism was casual and open in 1912. Chinese passengers were often treated as curiosities or threats, stereotyped and excluded from the social groups that formed among European passengers. They stuck together, created their own small community, and endured the voyage with the knowledge that prejudice would follow them to America. The Syrian and Armenian passengers faced similar issues. They looked different, spoke different languages, practiced different customs. Other passengers were sometimes welcoming, sometimes hostile, often simply confused and uncomfortable with difference. The Middle Eastern passengers dealt with constant low-level suspicion and occasional outright hostility, adding psychological burden to the physical discomforts of the voyage. The class consciousness among third-class passengers themselves was interesting. There was a hierarchy, even within third class. The English and Irish passengers sometimes looked down on Eastern Europeans. The Northern Europeans sometimes felt superior to Southern Europeans. Everyone seemed to look down on the Chinese passengers. The prejudices and hierarchies of the broader society were replicated in miniature within third class, humans creating pecking orders even among the oppressed. The reading materials available to third class were limited. There was no library for third class. If you wanted something to read, you brought it with you. Bibles were common. Some passengers had novels or newspapers from their home countries. But reading material was precious, passed around and shared. A single newspaper would be read by dozens of passengers until it fell apart. Books were treasured, read and reread until every word was memorized. Literacy rates varied dramatically among third-class passengers. Some were well-educated, literate in multiple languages. Others were barely literate in their native language, and completely illiterate in English. The literate passengers often served as informal translators and scribes, helping less educated passengers read documents or write letters. These informal hierarchies of knowledge created dependencies and power dynamics. The letter writing that happened during the voyage was poignant. Passengers would write letters to family left behind, describing the ship and the journey, expressing hopes and fears about the future. These letters would be mailed when the ship docked in New York. Some of those letters were from people who would die in the sinking, their words arriving after their deaths, creating devastating situations for recipients who'd read cheerful descriptions of a voyage that ended in tragedy. The storytelling was another form of entertainment. Older passengers would tell stories from their homelands, folk tales and legends passed down through generations. Children would gather to listen, even when they didn't understand the language, the rhythm and cadence of storytelling being universally compelling. The stories connected passengers to their cultures and provided free entertainment that required nothing but imagination. The rules and regulations of the ship were posted in English, which was useless for passengers who didn't read English. Important information about safety, emergency procedures, ship rules, all in a language that perhaps half of third class couldn't read. The assumption was that literate passengers would translate for others, which sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. Critical safety information often never reached non-English speakers. The daily routine became mind-numbing by day 3 or 4. Wake up, wait for bathroom, eat breakfast, wander the limited areas you had access to, eat lunch, wander more, eat dinner, sit in the general room or on deck, go to bed in your uncomfortable bunk, repeat. The monotony was broken only by interpersonal drama or your own thoughts about the massive life change you were undertaking. The boredom was particularly hard on people used to physical labor. The men who'd worked farms or factories were accustomed to active days filled with tasks. On the ship, there was nothing to do. No work, no useful activity. Just enforced idleness for days. The boredom felt like a physical pressure, making time crawl, making men restless and irritable. The weather during the Titanic's voyage was generally calm but cold. April in the North Atlantic is chilly, especially at night. The deck areas where third-class passengers could take air were open to the elements. You'd go up for fresh air and freeze. You'd return to the interior for warmth and suffocate from the stale air and smells. Neither option was comfortable. You alternated between too cold and too stuffy. All voyage. The icebergs were actually visible during the daylight hours before the collision. Passengers on deck saw ice floating in the water, sometimes sizable chunks, sometimes small pieces. The ice was fascinating and concerning. Everyone knew that icebergs were dangerous to ships. Seeing them so close created anxiety. But the crew assured passengers that everything was fine. The ship was watching for ice. There was no danger. Trust us, they said. We know what we're doing. The speed of the ship was a point of pride for the White Star Line and a point of concern for some passengers. The Titanic was trying to make good time, steaming at nearly full speed despite ice warnings. First-class passengers appreciated the speed, eager to reach New York quickly. Third-class passengers, who had nothing waiting for them except uncertainty, were less enthusiastic about speed and more concerned about safety. The conversations about the future dominated social interactions. What will you do in America? Where will you go? What work will you find? How will you survive? Everyone had hopes and plans, some realistic, some wildly optimistic. The baker who'd open a bakery, the tailor who'd have a shop, the farmer who'd buy land, the labourer who'd work hard and save and eventually own property. The American dream described in detail by people who had no guarantees they'd achieve any of it. The women's conversations focused on different concerns: finding housing, keeping families together, raising children in a new country, learning English, navigating a culture they didn't understand. The practical matters of survival worried them more than abstract dreams of wealth. Women carried the burden of making daily life work, while men dreamed of future prosperity. The fears were also shared freely. What if we can't find work? What if America isn't better than home? What if we made a mistake? The doubt was pervasive, hidden under optimistic talk, but present in every conversation. People had bet everything on this journey. What if they'd bet wrong? What if they'd given up everything they knew for a future that would be worse, not better? And then came the 14th of April, and all the conversations about the future became irrelevant, because for many there would be no future. The iceberg that ended the voyage didn't care about anyone's dreams or plans. It was ice and physics and bad luck, and it killed rich and poor alike, though it killed the poor in much larger numbers. The experience of the sinking for third-class passengers was chaos punctuated by long periods of waiting. Waiting at locked gates, waiting in queues for stairs, waiting for information that never came, waiting for rescue that didn't arrive. The survival of third-class passengers came down to luck, physical capability, and being in the right place at the right time. Factors that were largely beyond individual control. The people who survived by being pulled into boats at the last minute, or who jumped into the water and were picked up, or who found collapsible boats that were floating, all shared stories of near misses and incredible luck. A few seconds different, a few feet to the left or right, and they would have died. The randomness of survival was as troubling as the disaster itself. There was no justice in who lived and who died, just chance and circumstance. The bodies recovered after the sinking were mostly from first class. The recovery ships that went to the disaster site picked up bodies floating in life jackets. But third-class passengers were more likely to have gone down with the ship, trapped below decks, or to have drowned so quickly in the cold water that their bodies sank before recovery ships arrived. The majority of third-class victims were never recovered, never identified, never properly buried. They simply disappeared into the Atlantic. The mass graves in Halifax hold some Titanic victims, but many are unidentified. Graves marked unknown child or unknown man contain third-class passengers whose identities couldn't be determined from their bodies. DNA testing decades later identified some, but many remain nameless. They died without documentation, without anyone knowing who they were, reducing them to anonymous casualties in a disaster that at least gave first-class victims the dignity of identification. The compensation lawsuits that followed the sinking revealed the explicit monetary value placed on lives based on class. First-class passengers or their estates received thousands of dollars in settlements. Third class received hundreds or nothing at all. The legal system codified what the ship's design had implied. Rich lives were worth more than poor lives. Not morally, perhaps, but financially and practically, the value was calculated and paid out accordingly. The memorials to Titanic victims are mostly for the wealthy and famous. Statues, plaques, grave markers commemorating first-class passengers. The third-class victims get collective memorials, listing names if they're known, or just acknowledging that many poor immigrants died. The individual stories are forgotten, except for the very few that got documented. Most died anonymous, and stayed anonymous in memory. And here we are, over a century later, still talking about the Titanic. But when we talk about it, we talk about the millionaires who died nobly. We talk about the band playing. We talk about women and children first. We don't talk much about the locked gates, the 75% death rate in third class, the systematic inequality that determined who lived. That is not the story we tell. That is not the narrative we're comfortable with, but it is the truth. The Titanic was a class system afloat, and when it sank, the class system determined survival. Your ticket price predicted your survival chances with statistical accuracy. £7 bought you a 25% chance of living. £870 bought you a 62% chance. That is not tragedy. That is not fate. That is injustice. And injustice of that magnitude should make us uncomfortable, should make us angry, should make us question systems that value some lives over others. The third-class passengers of the Titanic were people, individuals with names, families, histories, futures they never got to live. They weren't background characters in someone else's story. They were people whose lives mattered just as much as anyone in first class. They just happened to be poor, and being poor on the Titanic meant being expendable. The gates were locked. The boats were filled with richer passengers. The survival instructions were in a language they couldn't read. And when the ship sank, they died in numbers that should haunt us. Because every disaster has its third class. Every tragedy has people who suffer more because they have less. Every emergency reveals who the system is designed to protect and who it considers acceptable losses. The Titanic wasn't unique. It was just unusually clear in its demonstration that your life is valued based on your economic worth. And that is a truth that applies far beyond one ship in 1912. It is a truth that is still operating today in every disaster where the poor die first and the rich escape to safety. The gates are still locked, they're just harder to see. Now let's examine specific moments during the sinking that illustrate the third-class experience in excruciating detail, because the statistics tell you 75% died, but statistics don't convey what that actually meant in human terms. Let's talk about what it felt like, what it looked like, what it sounded like to die as a third-class passenger on the Titanic. When the collision happened at 11:40 p.m., you were probably asleep or preparing for bed. The impact woke you if you were near the bow, where the iceberg struck, the sound was described differently by different passengers. Some said it was like thunder, others said it was more of a grinding, scraping sound. In third class at the bow, you felt it as a shudder that ran through the metal bed frame and into your body. Objects on shelves shifted. A cup might fall, nothing dramatic enough to cause immediate panic, but noticeable enough to wake you. You sat up in your bunk, disoriented, trying to understand what happened. Your cabin mates were stirring too, asking questions in various languages. Did you feel that? What was it? Should we go check? The decision whether to investigate or go back to sleep was made in those first minutes, and it was a decision that determined who lived and who died, though you didn't know it yet. The passengers who got up immediately, who decided to investigate, who put on clothes and went up on deck to ask questions. Those passengers got a head start that saved many of them. They were already dressed, already moving, already familiar with the route to the boat deck when the evacuation order came. The passengers who decided it was nothing, who rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, lost those crucial minutes, and many of them died because of that lost time. The water started entering the ship at the bow, exactly where many third-class single men were housed. The forward compartments began flooding within minutes of the collision. If your cabin was in one of those compartments, you knew something was seriously wrong much faster than passengers housed elsewhere. You felt the ship list forward. You heard water rushing somewhere below or nearby. You saw crew members running with unusual urgency. The sense that this was more than a minor incident came quickly. But even then, even with water audible and the ship listing, the crew were telling passengers that everything was fine. Stewards walking through third class areas were instructed to be calm, to reassure, to prevent panic. So they told you there was no danger, just a precaution, maybe go up on deck with a life jacket. But don't worry, the ship is unsinkable, everything is under control. And you wanted to believe them, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The stewards were following orders. They genuinely believed, at least initially, that the Titanic couldn't sink. The unsinkable ship rhetoric wasn't just marketing, it was something the crew believed. So when they told you everything was fine, they meant it. It wasn't until later, when the water kept rising and the list kept increasing, that the crew realized the situation was desperate. By then, precious time had been lost. The process of getting your family ready to evacuate was chaotic in ways that are hard to imagine if you've never experienced it. You need to wake sleeping children who are confused and scared. You need to get everyone dressed in warm clothes because you are going up on deck, and it is freezing out there. You need to find the life jackets, which might be stored in an awkward location, and figure out how to put them on properly, because you've never worn one before, and the instructions are in English which you might not read. All of this while the ship is listing, while other passengers are moving through corridors creating crowds and confusion, while children are crying, while you are trying to decide what to bring with you. Do you grab money, documents, the few precious items you own? How much can you carry while also carrying children? What if you need your hands free? The decisions had to be made in minutes, under stress, with incomplete information. And then there is the question of whether this is even necessary. Maybe the crew is right and this is just a precaution. Maybe you'll stand on deck for an hour in the freezing cold and then be allowed to return to your cabin, your children exhausted and cranky, having lost sleep for nothing. The uncertainty made some people move slowly, hesitating, second-guessing. That hesitation killed them. The families with many children faced impossible mathematics. If you had 4 or 5 children ranging from teenagers to infants, how did you get them all up 7 flights of stairs? The older children could walk on their own but needed supervision to not get lost in the crowds. The middle children might panic and freeze, needing to be carried or dragged. The youngest children had to be carried entirely. If you were a mother whose husband was off somewhere else, or if he was staying behind to help with evacuation, you were alone with multiple children, and no way to transport them all simultaneously. Some mothers made heartbreaking decisions. Take the older children and leave the younger ones in the cabin, temporarily, planning to come back for them. Except you couldn't come back because the ship was sinking faster than you realized, and the routes you'd taken were flooding. Those children left in cabins, told to wait for mother to return, died alone when the water reached them. The mothers who made those decisions had to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives, if they survived. The elderly and infirm faced different but equally impossible situations. If you couldn't climb stairs without help, if your mobility was limited, if you had a chronic condition that made physical exertion dangerous, the evacuation was a death sentence. You couldn't move fast enough. The people around you couldn't or wouldn't help because they were busy saving themselves and their own families. You'd make it up a flight or two and have to rest, gasping, while hundreds of people pushed past you. Each rest cost time you didn't have. Some elderly passengers gave up, Saturday down on a landing or in a corridor, and told family members to go on without them. This was presented in accounts as noble sacrifice, and maybe it was, but it was also resignation born from the knowledge that they physically couldn't continue. Their bodies wouldn't allow it, so they sent younger family members ahead and stayed behind to die. The ones who survived carried guilt about leaving grandparents or parents behind, even though there was no alternative. The claustrophobia of the stairwells during evacuation can't be overstated. The stairs were narrow, designed for crew use more than passenger traffic. They weren't meant to handle hundreds of people moving through them simultaneously in a panic. You were pressed against other bodies moving in fits and starts, the person in front of you stopping suddenly and causing a chain reaction of stops down the line. The air was thick with breath and fear, no ventilation, the smell of sweat and terror, and the stairs kept going up, flight after flight after flight. E deck to D deck, okay, that is 1. D to C, 2. C to B, 3. B to A, 4. A to the boat deck, 5. Except the routes weren't direct. You'd reach a landing and have to go down a corridor to reach the next stairwell. Signs were in English. Crew members directing traffic spoke English. If you didn't understand English, you followed the crowd and hoped they knew where they were going. The darkness made everything worse. The electric lights were still working initially, but they were dim and widely spaced. Shadows filled the stairwells. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The person in front of you was a dark shape, pressing against you, moving when you moved, stopping when you stopped. The person behind you was breathing down your neck, pushing you forward with their body. The crowd was a single organism, moving together, no individual control. When you finally reached a gate, and it was locked, the psychological impact was devastating. You'd climbed stairs for 10 minutes, exhausted yourself, got your family this far, and now you are stopped by a metal gate with a lock. The steward at the gate, if there was one, would explain that you need to wait, that they're controlling the flow of passengers, that you'll be let through shortly, but shortly kept stretching longer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The list of the ship becoming more pronounced, the sounds of chaos from above filtering down. The crowd behind the gate grew denser as more people arrived. You were pressed against the gate by the pressure of bodies behind you. Children were at risk of being crushed. People were shouting, demanding to be let through, arguing with the steward. The steward was overwhelmed, one person trying to control hundreds, following procedures that made no sense in an emergency, but which he'd been trained to follow. Some stewards eventually just left, abandoned their posts and went to save themselves. This left locked gates with no one to unlock them. Passengers trapped behind gates with no authority figure to appeal to. No one with keys, just a locked barrier between them and possible salvation. Some passengers managed to force gates open, breaking locks or finding alternative routes. Others didn't, and died waiting for someone to unlock a gate that would never be unlocked. The moment when you realized the ship was actually sinking, that this wasn't a drill or a precaution, but a real disaster that you might not survive, came at different times for different passengers. For some, it was seeing the water rising on lower decks. For others, it was the increasing list that made walking difficult. For others, it was the behavior of the crew, the fear breaking through their trained calm. That moment of realization was when panic truly set in. Panic looks different than movies portray it. Real panic isn't necessarily screaming and running wildly. It is often a cold, focused terror that makes you stop thinking clearly. You make stupid decisions because your brain isn't processing information normally. You forget which direction you came from. You can't remember where the stairs are. You stand frozen while others push past you. Or you make impulsive decisions, like jumping into water, that will kill you in minutes, because staying on the sinking ship seems worse. The language barriers became deadly during the evacuation. Critical information was being shouted in English. This boat is full. Go to the next one. Women and children only. Men must wait. This way to the lifeboats. If you didn't understand English, you didn't receive that information. You followed visual cues, watching what others did. But in chaos, visual cues were unclear and often wrong. You might follow someone who was also lost, both of you moving away from safety rather than toward it. The separation of families happened constantly and usually permanently. You'd be holding your child's hand in a crowd. The ship would lurch. People would surge forward. And suddenly your hand was empty. Your child was somewhere in the crowd, screaming for you, and you were screaming for them, but the noise and the darkness and the press of bodies made finding each other impossible. Some families were reunited. Many weren't. Children died alone looking for parents. Parents died knowing their children were lost somewhere in the chaos. The crew's attempts to maintain the women and children first policy in third class were inconsistent and chaotic. Some stewards enforced it strictly, physically blocking men from approaching boats. Others couldn't or didn't enforce it in the chaos. Some boats from the boat deck were already gone by the time third-class passengers reached it, and the remaining boats were being loaded with whoever was nearby. The policy that worked relatively well in first class, where passengers arrived early and orderly, broke down in third class, where passengers arrived late and desperate. The sight of the lifeboats being lowered with empty seats was devastating to third-class passengers who arrived just seconds too late. You'd fought your way up 7 decks, got your family to the boat deck against impossible odds, and you could see boats disappearing into the darkness below with visible empty spaces. You'd shout, try to get attention, but the officers lowering the boats couldn't or wouldn't wait. The boats went down half full, while you stood above, helpless, watching your survival float away. The officers in charge of loading boats were overwhelmed and making terrible decisions under pressure. Some believed that boats filled to capacity couldn't be safely lowered and would buckle or break. This was wrong. The boats were tested to much higher capacities, but the officers believed it and launched boats at half capacity as a result. Other officers were simply confused, not knowing how many people each boat could hold, guessing conservatively, and killing people through ignorance. Officer Lightoller, in charge of loading boats on the port side, was particularly fanatical about women and children only. He interpreted the order so strictly that he wouldn't allow boys over a certain age into boats. Teenage boys 13 or 14 years old were turned away because Lightoller considered them men. These boys, still children really, were sent to die because an officer interpreted an already problematic policy even more strictly than necessary. The Chinese passengers faced additional discrimination during the evacuation. There were 8 Chinese men travelling in third class, most as sailors or labourers. When they tried to board lifeboats, some officers refused them, assuming they were trying to sneak aboard in violation of women and children, first, despite several being genuinely needed to help row boats. 6 of the 8 Chinese passengers survived, but they did so through luck and persistence in the face of racial discrimination that made their survival even more difficult than it already was. The lifeboat drills that never happened haunt the Titanic story. The ship was supposed to have lifeboat drills for passengers and crew. None occurred during the voyage. Passengers didn't know where their boat stations were, how to put on life jackets properly, what to do in an emergency. The crew weren't trained on how to load boats efficiently, or how many people each boat could hold. The evacuation was improvised by people who'd never practiced it, and the lack of training killed people. The band famously played during the sinking, creating a surreal soundtrack to disaster. But third-class passengers couldn't hear it most of the time. The band was playing on the first-class deck. You were below in stairwells, in corridors, hearing screaming and shouting and crying and the groan of metal under stress. The myth of the band playing as the ship sank is true, but it was a first-class experience. Third class experienced the sinking to the sound of panic and despair. The moment when the lights went out was a turning point into deeper horror. The ship's electrical system failed around 2:18 a.m., about 15 minutes before the final plunge. Suddenly, everything was dark, not dim, not shadowy, but pitch black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The screaming intensified because without vision, people lost their remaining sense of orientation and control. The darkness made everything worse, made escape impossible, made death certain for anyone still below decks. The sound of the Titanic breaking apart was described by survivors as unlike anything they'd ever heard. A massive tearing, grinding explosion of metal under stress. The bow section had been underwater for minutes. The stern section was rising into the air, and the hull couldn't handle the stress. The ship snapped roughly between the third and fourth funnels. For the people still on the stern section, this was a moment of absolute terror. The deck they were standing on suddenly lurched, rows began tilting toward vertical. You couldn't maintain footing on a deck tilting that severely. You slid, or tried to hold on to railings, or fell and tumbled down the deck into the water. Objects that weren't secured slid with you. Deck chairs, equipment, other people. It was chaos in darkness, everyone and everything sliding toward the ocean. The people who managed to hold on to railings found themselves clinging to what was increasingly a vertical surface as the stern rose. The stern settled back briefly after the bow broke away. This gave a false hope that maybe the stern would float, that the buoyancy of the unflooded compartments would be enough. Some people who jumped into the water tried to swim back, thinking the stern would survive. But the hope lasted less than a minute before the stern began its final plunge, rising even higher than before, going completely vertical with its propellers in the air. Imagine being on a deck that is now a wall. The people clinging to railings were holding on for their lives, their arms burning, their grip slipping. Below them, 100-foot drop into freezing water. They couldn't hold on forever. One by one, they fell or let go, dropping into the ocean, screaming on the way down. The ones who held on longest went down with the ship when it finally sank, dragged under as the stern slipped beneath the surface. The suction created by the sinking was real, but probably less dramatic than movies portray. Large objects sinking create some suction, and people close to the ship when it went under were pulled down by the current. But it wasn't an irresistible vortex. Strong swimmers who were 20 or 30 feet away could fight the current and survive. The problem was that most third-class passengers weren't strong swimmers. The water was lethally cold, and the physical and psychological trauma made fighting any current nearly impossible. The people in the water died faster than you'd think. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius, below freezing but still liquid, because salt water, when you hit water that cold, your body goes into cold shock. You gasp involuntarily, often inhaling water, which causes drowning. If you avoid that, you have maybe 10 minutes before your muscles stop responding properly. 20 minutes, and you are probably unconscious. 30 minutes, and you are dead, your heart stopped by the cold. The life jackets kept you afloat, but couldn't keep you warm. You floated upright, your head above water, conscious and aware as hypothermia killed you. This was worse in some ways than drowning quickly would be. You had time to understand you were dying, time to feel the cold penetrating deeper, time to feel your body shutting down system by system. Your extremities went numb, your thinking became muddled, your vision blurred, and then you lost consciousness and died, still floating in your life jacket, your body remaining buoyant even after death. The screaming in the water lasted about 15 minutes after the ship went under. Hundreds of voices calling for help, crying, moaning, creating a sound that survivors described as the worst thing they ever heard. One survivor said it sounded like locusts in summer, a high-pitched collective wail that filled the night. Another said it was like a symphony of despair, every note a human life ending. The screaming faded gradually as people died, the volume decreasing, the voices stopping one by one until silence. The lifeboats floating nearby could hear the screaming. The approximately 700 survivors in boats listened to approximately 1,500 people dying in the water, and most boats did nothing. The people in the boats were afraid to go back, afraid that desperate swimmers would swamp the boats and capsize them, killing everyone. This fear was probably exaggerated, but it was real, and it kept most boats from attempting rescue. They rowed away from the screaming, away from the dying, saving themselves at the cost of others. Only Lifeboat 14, under 5th Officer Lowe's command, went back to rescue survivors from the water, but Lowe waited. He waited about 20 minutes after the ship went under, waited for the screaming to mostly stop, waited for most people to die before going back. His reasoning was coldly logical. If he went back immediately, the boat would be overwhelmed by desperate people, and everyone would die. If he waited until most had died, he could safely pick up the few remaining survivors. The logic saved 4 lives, but it meant deliberately waiting for hundreds to die. The 4 people pulled alive from the water by Lifeboat 14 were incredibly lucky. They survived the cold longer than average, remained conscious, while others died around them, were in the right location when the boat came back. One of them was a Chinese passenger, Fang Lang, who survived by finding a floating door and getting out of the water. His survival against terrible odds was remarkable. The others were strong, young men who could better fight the cold. But their survival was still primarily luck, being slightly less dead than everyone else when rescue arrived. The bodies floating in the water were a horrifying sight that first-class survivors largely avoided, but which some in lifeboats had to witness. By morning, when the Carpathia arrived, the bodies had been in the water for nearly 6 hours. Some had stayed afloat in life jackets. Others had sunk. The ones still visible were eerie, floating upright, some with arms reaching up, some frozen in death postures. The lifeboats being rescued had to row through fields of bodies, an image that survivors reported in nightmares for years afterward. The recovery of bodies took days. Ships went to the disaster site and picked up bodies floating on the surface. They recovered about 330 bodies in total. The rest, over 1,100 people, were never recovered. Some sank immediately. Some sank after floating for hours. Some were carried away by currents and sank in deep water where they'd never be found. The majority of Titanic victims have no graves, no burial sites, no physical markers. They're just gone, dissolved into the Atlantic. The process of identifying recovered bodies was grim. The recovered bodies were brought to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they were examined, photographed, documented. Personal effects were catalogued: jewellery, clothing, pocket contents, anything that might help with identification. The first-class bodies were usually identified quickly through quality of clothing, jewellery, or documents found on them. Third-class bodies were harder to identify, and many remained unknown. The condition of bodies varied based on how long they'd been in the water and what they'd experienced during the sinking. Some were remarkably intact, the cold water preserving them. Others were damaged from trauma during the sinking or from time in the water. Some were barely recognizable as human. The workers handling the bodies, sailors and morticians in Halifax, dealt with sights and smells that traumatized them. Several reportedly had breakdowns or refused to continue working with the bodies. The burial of bodies in Halifax created several cemeteries that now hold Titanic victims. The cemeteries are segregated by class and religion, even in death. There is a Jewish cemetery with Titanic victims, a Catholic cemetery, a non-denominational cemetery, and within each cemetery the graves are sorted roughly by class. First-class victims got elaborate monuments. Third-class victims got simple markers or shared graves. Even dead, the class distinction remained. Some families never learned what happened to their relatives. Third-class passengers from remote villages in Ireland or Italy, whose families had limited literacy and no access to telegraphs, might never have received definite confirmation of death. They just knew their family member boarded the Titanic and never arrived in New York. Maybe they died. Maybe they were injured and recovering somewhere. Maybe they survived and went somewhere else. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, hope and grief mixed indefinitely. The financial impact on families of third-class victims was catastrophic in ways that first-class deaths weren't. If a first-class man died, his family was wealthy enough to survive financially. If a third-class man died, his family lost their primary earner, the person whose labour supported everyone. Widows were left with children and no income in societies that provided little support for single mothers. Many ended up in poorhouses or dependent on charity. The death rippled outward, destroying lives for years. The children orphaned by the sinking faced particularly grim futures if they had no family to take them in. Orphanages in 1912 were institutions of last resort, overcrowded and underfunded. Children in orphanages received minimal education, poor nutrition, and were expected to work from young ages. Many were apprenticed out to employers who exploited their labour. Being orphaned by the Titanic meant a childhood of poverty and hardship, even if you'd survived the sinking physically intact. The psychological trauma of Titanic survivors was largely untreated because psychology wasn't developed enough in 1912 to help them. PTSD, survivor's guilt, grief disorders, anxiety disorders, all the conditions that modern survivors would be treated for were not recognised as treatable conditions. You were expected to be grateful you survived and move on with your life. The fact that you couldn't sleep, that you had nightmares, that you couldn't board ships or even take baths without panic was your personal failing, not a legitimate medical condition. Many survivors self-medicated with alcohol or drugs. Laudanum, a opium-based medicine, was freely available and commonly used. Survivors dealing with pain, physical or psychological, could easily become addicted. Alcoholism was common among male survivors. These coping mechanisms were seen as moral failings rather than symptoms of untreated trauma. Society judged survivors who struggled rather than helping them. The survivors who did best, psychologically, were those who could talk about their experiences and who had community support. Irish survivors who returned to tight-knit communities where everyone knew what happened and supported them recovered better than isolated survivors who had no one who understood. But even the best-case survivors carried trauma for life. The Titanic shaped them permanently. They were never the same people they'd been before boarding. The aging survivors, interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s as interest in the Titanic revived, still showed signs of trauma 60 or 70 years later. They'd cry while recounting the sinking. They'd refuse to discuss certain details. They'd still have nightmares about cold water and drowning, trauma that profound doesn't heal completely, even with decades of distance. The Titanic remained the defining event of their lives until death. The last survivors died in the early 2000s. Milvina Dean, the youngest passenger on board, just 2 months old during the sinking, died in 2009. She was the final living link to the disaster. Her death meant the Titanic passed from living memory into pure history. There is no one alive now who remembers being on that ship, who felt the cold water, who heard the screaming. The experience is now entirely mediated through documents, interviews, artifacts. The lived experience is gone, but the lessons remain, or they should. The Titanic demonstrated clearly that class matters, that inequality kills, that systems designed to protect the powerful will sacrifice the powerless. Every safety regulation written after the Titanic, every requirement for sufficient lifeboats and emergency procedures was written in the blood of third-class passengers who died unnecessarily. The changes came too late for them, but maybe saved others. And yet, we still have disasters where the poor die disproportionately. Hurricane Katrina killed the poor who couldn't evacuate. Building collapses kill garment workers in unsafe factories. Migrants die in unsafe transit. The pattern of third class on the Titanic repeats endlessly. The specifics change, but the fundamental dynamic remains. When disaster strikes, the people with fewer resources, fewer options, less social power, they die first, and in greater numbers. The gates are still locked. The boats still leave half empty. The powerful still escape while the powerless drown. The Titanic isn't just history. It is a parable, a clear, undeniable demonstration of how society values human life based on economic class. You can't argue that the system wasn't designed that way when the design is so obvious. Third class at the bottom of the ship, behind locked gates, with limited boat access. First class at the top, near the boats, with staff prioritizing their evacuation. The architecture literally reflected the social hierarchy. And when the ship sank, the architecture killed people. So yes, remember the Titanic, remember it happened. Remember the ship sank and 1,500 people died. But remember specifically how they died, and why. Remember that being poor made you 3 times more likely to die. Remember the locked gates. Remember the families separated. Remember the children waiting for mothers who couldn't come back. Remember the elderly who couldn't climb the stairs. Remember the non-English speakers who couldn't understand evacuation instructions. Remember all of it, the specific ways that poverty and inequality translated into death. Because if we remember the Titanic only as a tragic accident, as fate or bad luck, we miss the point. It wasn't fate. It was design. The ship was designed to segregate classes. The evacuation was designed to prioritize the wealthy. The aftermath was designed to value first-class deaths more than third-class deaths. At every stage, from construction to compensation, the system was designed to treat third-class passengers as less valuable, and that design killed them. The third-class passengers of the Titanic deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a tragedy, but as people who were murdered by a system that valued their lives less than others. That is harsh language, but it is accurate. When you design a ship with insufficient lifeboats, when you lock gates during an evacuation, when you prioritize saving the wealthy while the poor drown, that is not accident or tragedy, that is a choice. A series of choices made by people with power about people without power, and those choices had consequences measured in over 1,000 lives. So when you think about the Titanic, think about this. Your £7 ticket bought you a metal bunk, cold water, minimal food, restricted access, and a 25% chance of survival. Your £870 ticket bought you a luxury suite, servants, fine dining, freedom to move throughout the ship, and a 62% chance of survival. The difference between those experiences was £863. The difference in survival rates was 37 percentage points. The equation was clear: money equals survival, poverty equals death. And that equation didn't happen by accident. It was built into every decision about how the ship was designed, how passengers were treated, and how evacuation was prioritized. The Titanic sank on the 15th of April, 1912, taking 1,517 people with it. But the system that killed those people is still afloat. It is still determining who lives and who dies in disasters. It is still locking gates and filling lifeboats with the wealthy and leaving the poor to drown. We've learned some lessons about ship safety. We haven't learned the bigger lesson about valuing all human lives equally. And until we do, every disaster will have its third class, and they will keep dying in disproportionate numbers while we shake our heads and call it tragedy, instead of calling it what it is: structural violence dressed up as bad luck. Think about the individual faces behind those statistics one more time. Not the famous first-class passengers whose stories everyone knows, but the third-class passengers whose names are forgotten. The 19-year-old Irish girl leaving home for the first time, hoping to work as a maid in Boston and send money back to her family. She died in a stairwell, crushed in the panic. Her body never recovered. Her family in Ireland waited months for news, hoping she'd just been delayed, that she'd write eventually. The letter never came. The Syrian father travelling with his wife and 4 children, everything they owned converted to tickets, heading to Pennsylvania where his cousin had found work in a factory. The whole family died together when their cabin flooded. 6 people who dreamed of American opportunity, gone in minutes, their futures erased. The factory job went to someone else. The cousin never knew exactly what happened, just that they'd been on the Titanic and hadn't survived. The Swedish couple, newlyweds, married 3 weeks before boarding. They were starting life together, travelling to Minnesota where land was cheap and farming was possible. They died, separately, the husband staying back when women and children were loaded first, the wife refusing to leave without him. Both drowned. Their wedding photographs were never recovered. Their families in Sweden mourned 2 deaths, and the loss of the family line they'd hoped the couple would continue. The Italian teenager travelling alone, sent ahead by his family to establish residency, and then bring the rest over once he'd saved enough money. He was 16, barely spoke English, had $8 in his pocket, and an address written on paper. He died in the water, hypothermia taking him within 20 minutes of the ship going down. The family waited years, hoping for news, before finally accepting he was gone. They never emigrated. The dream died with him. The Chinese labourer who'd survived discrimination and hardship to buy a third-class ticket, hoping America would be better than the limited opportunities available to Chinese workers in Britain. He was one of the 8 Chinese passengers, and unlike most, he didn't survive. His body was recovered, cremated in Halifax, because no one knew his family's preferences or how to contact them. His ashes were buried in an unmarked grave. His family in China likely never learned his fate. The Jewish family fleeing Eastern European pogroms, hoping America would be safer than the violence they were leaving. Parents, 3 children, a grandmother. All 7 died. The grandmother couldn't climb the stairs. The parents wouldn't leave her. The children couldn't be convinced to go without their parents. The whole family stayed together and drowned together. Their synagogue in Russia held memorial services for them. The community remembered them as casualties of both persecution and disaster, as if they hadn't suffered enough already. The Armenian refugees escaping the violence that would within a few years become genocide. 2 brothers travelling together, planning to save money and bring the rest of their family to safety. Both died when the stern went vertical, and they fell from the deck into the water. Their family, remaining in Armenia, was later killed in the genocide. The brothers who died on the Titanic might have been the lucky ones. At least their deaths were quick. These weren't just numbers, they were people with families, with hopes, with plans, with entire futures that never happened. Each death created ripples of grief and economic catastrophe that spread through families and communities. A dead son meant no support for aging parents. A dead father meant a widow and orphans struggling to survive. A dead breadwinner meant poverty and dependence on charity that might not come. The human cost wasn't just the 1517 who died. It was everyone whose lives were destroyed by those deaths. And the bitter irony is that many of these deaths were preventable. If the ship had enough lifeboats for everyone, as regulations would later require, if the gates had been unlocked immediately, if evacuation had been practiced and organised, if women and children first had actually meant all women and children, not just wealthy ones, if the crew had been properly trained, if the ship had slowed down when ice warnings came in, but the ifs don't bring anyone back. They just highlight how unnecessary those deaths were. The White Star Line faced lawsuits and financial consequences, but the company survived. It merged with Cunard Line in 1934, and the corporate entity that owned the Titanic continued making money from ocean travel. The people who made the decisions that killed third-class passengers faced no criminal charges. The captain went down with the ship. The designer died in the sinking. But the executives who'd approved insufficient lifeboats, who'd designed the class segregation, who'd prioritised profit over safety, they faced no real consequences. The system protected them as thoroughly as it had failed to protect third-class passengers. The memorialisation of the Titanic disaster focuses overwhelmingly on first-class victims and crew heroism. Museums display first-class artifacts, jewelry, clothing, dishes from the dining room. The third-class artifacts are usually communal items, not personal effects, because most third-class passengers' belongings were lost with them. You can see a first-class passenger's diary or watch. You rarely see a third-class passenger's personal effects because they didn't have the luxury of packing keepsakes. They packed necessities, and those necessities sank with them. The films made about the Titanic, from the 1950s through the 1997 blockbuster and beyond, romanticize the disaster. They focus on love stories and heroic sacrifices. The 1997 film at least acknowledged the class dynamics through its central relationship between a first-class woman and a third-class man. But even that film, for all its massive budget and historical detail, couldn't fully convey the reality of third-class experience. Movies need heroes and narratives. The reality was just death, mostly random, mostly unfair, with no heroes except the people who tried to save themselves and their families and failed through no fault of their own. The conspiracy theories about the Titanic range from the bizarre to the offensively stupid. Claims that it was insurance fraud, that the ship that sank was actually the Olympic, that J.P. Morgan deliberately caused the sinking to kill his rivals. These theories are nonsense, easily disproven by evidence, but they persist because people prefer complex conspiracies to simple truths. The truth is that the Titanic sank because of hubris, cost-cutting, and bad luck. No conspiracy needed, just human failings amplified by scale and circumstances. The wreck of the Titanic, found in 1985 by Robert Ballard, provided closure of sorts, but also raised questions about disturbing the dead. The ship is a grave site. Over 1,100 people died there, and their bodies are still there, or what remains of them. Exploring the wreck, taking artifacts, feels to some like grave robbing. Others argue that the historical value justifies it, that we learn from studying the wreck. Both perspectives have merit. The question is whether education justifies disturbing the dead, and different people answer that differently based on their values. The condition of the wreck deteriorates yearly. Salt water corrodes metal. Bacteria consume the iron. Rust stalactites called rusticles drape from every surface. The ship is slowly dissolving back into the ocean. Within a few decades, it may be too deteriorated to recognize as a ship at all. Eventually, it will be just a debris field on the ocean floor, and even that will be scattered and buried by sediment over centuries. The physical evidence of the disaster will disappear. Only the memory and the records will remain, and memories fade and records can be ignored. The lessons of the Titanic are taught in schools, but often as a story of hubris and tragedy, rather than as a lesson about class inequality and systemic injustice. Students learn that the Titanic was called unsinkable and then sank, a cautionary tale about human pride. They learn less often about how the death rate correlated with ticket price, about locked gates and half-empty lifeboats, about the specific ways that poor people were sacrificed to give rich people better chances of survival. Those lessons are uncomfortable. They implicate systems that still exist. Better to focus on the pride, goeth before, a fall narrative that doesn't challenge current inequalities. The regulations that changed after the Titanic improved ship safety significantly. International Ice Patrol was established to track icebergs and warn ships. Lifeboat capacity requirements were updated to require enough spaces for all passengers and crew. Radio watch became mandatory 24 hours a day. Emergency drills became required. These changes saved lives on future voyages. But they were reactive, implemented after disaster proved they were necessary. The people who died on the Titanic paid the price for lessons that protected others. Their deaths brought safety for future passengers. But they probably would have preferred to live. The cultural impact of the Titanic persists beyond what you'd expect for a single disaster. It is referenced constantly, used as metaphor, invoked whenever someone wants to discuss inevitable disaster or hubris. Corporate failures are called rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Failed projects are described as the Titanic of industry. The ship name became synonymous with disaster itself. This cultural persistence is partly because the disaster was so dramatic, but also because it happened at a specific moment when media could document and spread the story globally. The Titanic was one of the first disasters that the whole world knew about simultaneously. The economic impact of the Titanic disaster was significant but localized. The ship itself was a major financial loss. The lawsuits cost money. But the White Star Line survived, and the shipping industry continued. Southampton, where many crew members lived, was devastated, because so many crew died and their families lost their providers. Whole streets became widows and orphans, an entire community's economic foundation destroyed in one night. The city's economy struggled for years. But for most of the world, the Titanic was a tragedy to read about, not an economic disaster to live through. The technological advances that the Titanic represented continued developing. The ship was state-of-the-art for 1912. It had electric lights, elevators, watertight compartments, wireless telegraph, all innovations that were new and impressive. The sinking didn't stop technological progress. If anything, it spurred improvements in shipbuilding and safety technology. The legacy of the Titanic in engineering is complex, a demonstration of both human capability to build amazing things and human inability to anticipate all failure modes. The comparison between Titanic and later disasters is instructive. The Lusitania sank in 1915, torpedoed by a German U-boat, killing 1,198 people. The Empress of Ireland sank in 1914 in the St. Lawrence River, killing 1,012. The General Slocum caught fire in New York Harbor in 1904, killing over 1,000. Maritime disasters killed thousands in the early 20th century. The Titanic was the most famous, but not the deadliest. Its fame came from who was on board, how unsinkable it was supposed to be, and how thoroughly it failed to be unsinkable. The way we remember the Titanic says more about us than about the disaster itself. We remember the love story more than the mass death. We remember the brave band playing more than the people screaming in the water. We remember the ship's luxury more than the people who couldn't access that luxury. Our collective memory edits out the uncomfortable parts, the parts that implicate systems of inequality that still exist. We prefer a tragedy we can feel sad about to an injustice we'd have to do something about. And that preference, that choice to remember selectively, is its own form of injustice against the people who died. The third-class passengers of the Titanic deserve better than to be footnotes in someone else's story. They deserve to be remembered as they were, people whose lives mattered, who had hopes and dreams, who were killed by a system that valued them less because they were poor. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics but as individuals, each one a full human being whose death was a tragedy. They deserve to have their story told honestly, including all the uncomfortable truths about how and why they died. So here is the truth, unvarnished and uncomfortable. The Titanic was a ship designed around class inequality, where your value as a human being was measured in pounds sterling, and when it sank, that inequality determined who lived and who died. The rich were saved at the expense of the poor. The gates were locked. The boats left half empty, and over 1,000 people died unnecessary deaths that could have been prevented if their lives had been valued as much as the lives of first-class passengers. That is the story of third class on the Titanic. Not a romance, not a tragedy in the classical sense. An injustice, a preventable mass death caused by a system that prioritized profit over human life, that segregated people by class, and then used that segregation to determine who was worth saving. And the worst part, the system didn't die with the ship. It is still here, still operating, still determining whose lives matter and whose don't. The gates are still locked. We've just learned to make them less visible.